Good evening. Thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar on the Colorado River, presented in partnership with the Eagle River Watershed Council. I'm Chris Sable, Executive Director for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Dale Mosier, our board chair, and the entire Vail Symposium board, welcome. The Vail Symposium has been offering affordable, thought-provoking programming to the Vail community since 1971. Two items to be aware of before we get started. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. You can type those in at any time, and we'll get to those later in the program. The program will run until 7:15. It is being recorded, and the video will be available at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to thank the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's programming possible. Our presenting sponsors are the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are the Vail Daily, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, and the Antlers at Vail. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank, and Cindy Ingalls has underwritten the summer season. The Environmental Awareness Series is underwritten by Holly and Buck Elliott, and tonight's program is underwritten by Jerry Anderson. Donors at every level make our programming possible. Thank you. I also want to thank James Ildell and the Eagle River Watershed Council for partnering with us on this program. We close out our fall-summer series with a Speaking Locally program in collaboration with the Vail Valley Partnership called State of the Valley on November 9th from 8:30 to 10 a.m. at CMC in Edwards. Our winter season will begin again in December, and we're working on another lineup of topical and timely programs. Tonight, we turn our attention to the Colorado River, which has been in the news nonstop since we started developing this program back in April. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Luke Runyon, a journalist covering water and climate change in the Western U.S. for a collaborative network of public media stations throughout the Colorado River watershed. His position is based at NPR member station KUNC. He currently serves as a board member for the Society of Environmental Journalists. It's my pleasure to welcome Luke. And just as a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Luke, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. And we have a lot to cover in a very short amount of time. So I figured we would just jump right in. Thanks, Chris, for that introduction. Like Chris said, I am a public radio reporter. I am a managing editor for a project that focuses almost exclusively on Colorado River Basin issues across the Southwest. And I thought I would open tonight with a story. Just that's what I do for a living, so it feels pretty familiar to start with a story. And one thing that I've found in covering the Colorado River now for several years is it can feel like such a large issue and problem that it helps to zoom in on one particular area in order to try and understand it and see some of these issues illustrated in a very discrete geography. So I took a trip to Lake Powell in July. For those who aren't familiar, Lake Powell is right on the border between Arizona and Utah. It is the second largest reservoir in the country. It sits on the Colorado River. Glen Canyon Dam creates the reservoir. And it's currently at a low point that it hasn't been at since it first filled in the 1960s. And Chris, if you want to pull those slides up, I can show off some of the photos from that trip that I took down in July. And this is an overview of what's called the height overlook. This is the kind of far upper reaches of what used to be Lake Powell, now is kind of a giant mud flat that the Colorado River is carving back through. And if you look really closely, you can see this tiny boat access point along the river, and that's where we started our journey. I was with folks from a group called Returning Rapids and the Glen Canyon Institute, and we launched these two metal motorboats from that boat access point to look at what it looks like on the ground to see Lake Powell at such a low point. And you can kind of get a sense, this would have been Lake Powell. There was a marina pier at one point, but now it's essentially just a sediment flat with the river carving through. Chris, you can go to the next slide. This is a look downstream, down towards Lake Powell, Also from height overlook, you can, there was like I said, there was this marina off to the side. This is really kind of the Colorado River reclaiming parts of its old channel that used to be inundated by the reservoir. And now because the reservoir is so low, the river is carving back through. And that's where we kind of started our journey. Next slide. These were these little metal motorboats that we were going down through. And you can see the canyon walls off in the distance, but then that ledge that's right behind us, this is that sediment formation that as the Colorado River has flowed into Lake Powell for years and decades, it deposited all this sediment on the bottom of the reservoir. And because the reservoir isn't in these areas anymore, the river is carving through that really large sediment deposit. And we were essentially boating over rapids that are made of mud. You know, a lot of times river rapids are made of rocks and you use inflatable rafts. These are rapids made of mud that are kind of changing by the hour as the Colorado River is carving down into this mud. You can see me there, I'm multitasking, taking a photo and recording sound at the same time. Chris, you can go to the next slide. This is a close-up of that sediment deposit. Some people call it the Dominy Formation. Floyd Dominy was the Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner when Lake Powell and Glen Canyon Dam were first being constructed, and so kind of a pejorative way of describing some of the sediment. But it's this very considerable amount of sediment that is piled up along the sides of the Colorado River now where Lake Powell used to be. Chris, next slide. There's me sliding down the Dominy Formation. This is it's this incredibly fine sediment that has collected along the sides of the river. Now that it's carving down through here, we hiked up to one ledge of this sediment formation. One of the people that we were with in this group, he was putting in a time-lapse camera to kind of document and chart some of the changes that they're seeing to the river rapids as the river continues to carve through that mud. They're starting to see old rapids return in Cataract Canyon. It's pretty neat, but it's also kind of dangerous. I almost triggered a dirt avalanche as I was climbing up and down it. Chris, you can go to the next slide. That kind of gives you a sense too of the sediment in this kind of delta of Lake Powell. We did a 3-day trip through this area, and what's kind of crazy about it is as the river is carving down, these gnarled, craggy sediment formations are poking out of the river, and you can kind of get a sense of it in this photograph of these really weird formations. One of the guys we were with described it as like a river on an acid trip, or that we were like floating through Mordor in The Lord of the Rings. Like, this place is super strange, and it's going through really rapid change that we were able to see up close and personal on this trip. Next slide. We ended up going down into Lake Powell. And like I said, if you've never been to Lake Powell, it's kind of a motorboater's dream. You've got these massive houseboats that post up in these side canyons and people ripping through on wake boats. It's kind of like people come from all over to go boating on Lake Powell. And you really got a sense of that once we were down into the reservoir, away from the flowing river into this kind of still water reservoir. It's kind of a weird transition between these two worlds. Next slide. And we did a hike up into one of the side canyons where the reservoir used to be, and you find all of these remnants of when the reservoir was full. When you're hiking in these canyons, you can look above you and see, a high water mark 100 feet above your head. And when you look at the ground, you can oftentimes find these artifacts of when the reservoir used to fill this canyon. And one of them was this life jacket that was just sitting on the ground as this new vegetation is growing out of the sediment. Next slide. we hiked up into one of these side canyons, found a sunken motorboat. And one of the things that was so strange to me was I kept getting these sort of side-by-side images in my head of, you would feel like you were, my mind would flash and you would be at the bottom of Lake Powell in these side canyons where it's like cold and dark and underwater. And then you would flash back into reality and you were in a desert canyon. And it wasn't that long ago that these side canyons were filled to the brim with water. So really everywhere you look are reminders of just how changed this landscape is. And a lot of this is being driven by climate change. Next slide. You can see there are these ghost forests, cottonwood forests that were inundated with water in the 1960s when the reservoir was first filling. They're everywhere. And they were kind of preserved in place as standing dead trees. And now they've all started to reemerge as the reservoir drops. Next slide. And we did a little hike up into one of these side canyons that used to be filled with water and is now returning with a lot of vegetation. Cottonwood forests are starting to pop back up. A lot of vegetation is growing. We saw tons of tadpoles in the streams that are coming out of here. A lot of them are spring fed. And a lot of it is just water from the reservoir that is trapped in the sandstone that's returning back to the reservoir. Is that it for my slides, Chris, or is there one more? I think that's it. So why show these photos? Well, this is the kind of change that we're seeing on the ground. And it sort of highlights the way that people are interpreting this moment, because for the environmental activists that we were with, seeing Lake Powell at this low point was a moment of hope for them because they've wanted to see the reservoir go away for a long time. Meanwhile, in my coverage, lots of other people are seeing Lake Powell and its current low level as scary, or are feeling anxious about the way that water levels are dropping in the Colorado River Basin. The ripple effects of the shortage that we're experiencing right now are many, and I'm hoping that we can lean on our panelists to tease out some of those ripple effects. So let's jump into our discussion now that we've finished my my photo slideshow. So what I'm going to ask each of our panelists to do, I'm going to toss it to them, have them briefly introduce themselves. And then what I'd like each of you to respond to is, how would you characterize the current moment that the Colorado River is in right now? And maybe we should start with Commissioner Calimlim Touton. Commissioner?
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you, Luke. Really enjoyed seeing your pictures as you looked at Lake Powell. So I have the privilege of leading the Bureau of Reclamation. The Bureau of Reclamation operates in 17 Western states. So not just the Colorado River Basin, but across 189 projects in the West. We serve as the infrastructure backbone for water and power in the West. So if you've seen the lights of Las Vegas, had a glass of water in Phoenix, recreated in Lake Powell or Lake Chida in North Dakota, eaten stone fruit in Central Valley, those are the types of experiences, the types of products that we help to support in the American West. Your question on what we're seeing on the Colorado River, I think it's a change, but I would also say opportunity. And I look forward to discussing that more with our panelists.
Great, thanks so much, Commissioner. Next, we'll bring in Pat Mulroy. Pat, do you want to introduce yourself and say how you would characterize the moment that we're in on the river?
Yes, hi. I'm Pat Mulroy. For 30 years, I was the head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority in the Las Vegas Valley Water District. I have traveled the journey of this drought from its beginning to where it is today, and have watched its various machinations as we have incrementalized ourselves to various solutions and to various stepping stones along the way. And I'm not as optimistic as Camille is. I see it as a moment of truth. And I think it's a moment of reality for a lot of states. I mean, I very much appreciate the environmental view of a empty Lake Powell, but there's a reality check for the upper basin in that empty Lake Powell, and I'm sure we'll get into it. So.
Great, thanks so much, Pat.
Hi, Pat.
All right, next we'll move to Paul Bruchez. Paul, do you want to introduce yourself and say how you'd characterize the moment?
Thanks, Luke. Hello to everybody. Honor and privilege to be here tonight. I am a rancher from the headwaters of the Colorado River in the state of Colorado, and was appointed to represent the main stem for the Colorado Water Conservation Board here within the last year. You know, my family, we operate our ranch and agriculture, as well as our outfitting business on the Colorado River. You know, it's the lifeblood of what we do. We see it on a daily level, and I think that now is a moment of urgency for action and adaptation. And I would say that I appreciate the enthusiasm of Commissioner Touton, that I think that we can prove, you know, the spotlight of drought is on the Colorado River right now. However, this is much more of a global issue in a lot of ways, and affecting a lot of parts of our nation, I think, substantially. And I think that I look at the way that we work within solutions in the Colorado River can potentially present as a model for not only the rest of the country, but the globe, about how we can come together and work on things in collaboration. And so I look forward to tonight's discussion.
Great, thanks, Paul. And our last panelist is Matt Rice of American Rivers. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about the moment?
Sure, thanks, Luke. So my name is Matt Rice. I'm the Southwest Regional Director for American Rivers. American Rivers is a national river conservation organization. I would say, kind of pulling off of what everybody else has said a bit, it's a moment of crisis, but with crisis comes opportunity. So I really believe that, you know, we are not going to be able to kind of meet this moment unless we have these discussions that do focus on the opportunities. And I think the slideshow that you showed, Luke, is an opportunity. I mean, I was in Lake Powell also in this past summer, and what really struck me was that it's not a river anymore, and it's not a reservoir anymore. It's something in between, right? And maybe there's something that we can take from that, and we can both protect our water supplies and, you know, the hundreds of cultural sites that are emerging, the natural values that are emerging as well. And you know, this is clearly not to advocate for the decommission of Lake Powell, but I think we're going to be seeing more and more of these opportunities all over the Southwest and the Colorado River Basin.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for being here. And just a reminder for the Q&A. So if you've got a question, throw it in the Q&A section. And as those questions come up, we'll toss them into the discussion. Otherwise, we've got some time at the end for audience Q&A as well. Commissioner Touton, I want to start with you. You made some news in June in front of a Senate committee hearing, where you kind of laid out that sort of direness in the Colorado River Basin and put some numbers behind it, which hadn't really been done in that kind of significant way in a long time. And you called for 2 to 4 million acre feet in conservation over the next year for the Colorado River. The states really haven't come up with a way to meet that number just yet. Can you lay out what the federal government is doing right now to meet that level of conservation that's needed to protect the Colorado River?
Sure. So I think when we look at how we got to that number, you know, we're using the best available science that we're seeing. But across the Colorado River and the West as a whole, we're seeing a very similar fact pattern. Increased temperatures leading to earlier snowmelt, and then dry soils leading to less runoff, and therefore exacerbating the already low reservoir levels that we're seeing in our system, not just in the Colorado River system, in most of our systems across the West. A good example of that, when you say, you know, at least we could just have snow and there'll be a good water year. What we're seeing now in water year 21, was we had 90% of snow water equivalent that translated into 29% of runoff into Powell. This year, we saw 90% of snow water equivalent, and it was 59% of runoff. So we are seeing the meteorological drought of snow, and rain in some instances, though in this case, 90%, it's not bad, right? But we're also seeing the hydrologic effects of less runoff into our reservoirs. And so as we're looking at the system, that's how our experts on our team came to those numbers on how much volume of water do you need to protect the system. So when we looked at talking about that, and I think that's the part of this too, is having a level of transparency about what we're seeing. We went to the states, and we're having conversations with the states, and I think there's a lot of forward movement that we're seeing that we can discuss later. But we outlined in August 16th some of the actions that we're looking at, including perhaps revisiting the 2007 ROD, looking at tools that we have never utilized before in EVAP and seepage. But we laid out all of those actions, and our team are working through that now to further define those. Should we be prepared to act in 23? But I am optimistic, as I'm realistic, but I am optimistic that we're going to get there with the states. That's how we've done business in this river. That's the best solution, and I'm going to keep pushing that. But we're prepared to be able to do things as well.
I feel like I've heard more discussion lately about people really wanting the federal government to take on more of a leadership role in the basin when it comes to making hard decisions. Do you see that as that's what the federal government's role is in managing the Colorado River Basin, is that it comes in to make hard decisions for the states, or is it to be more of this kind of convener for all of the parties involved?
I see our role in the basin to be able to be part of the conversation, but also we are responsible for our facilities. But I do think, as it's been proven in the last 100 years, perhaps it's being tested this year, the right way to go is with working with the states and the tribes to be able to get to a path forward in the future. And I see my friend Matt Rice there too. I haven't forgotten about the ecosystem as well. But that it really is the way this basin has always been, and that's the way that we've been approaching it. But we're also realistic about the very real challenges that our organization is seeing across the West that we've never seen before in the history of this organization.
Pat, I wonder, we've known about this sort of supply and demand imbalance along the Colorado River for a really long time, probably for for the entire time that you were at the Southern Nevada Water Authority, people were talking
Not
about
the
this
entire
supply
time.
for a portion of the time. They were talking about this kind of fundamental supply and demand imbalance that we've known about on the Colorado River. So if we knew about it for so long, how have we let it get to this point where the reservoirs are so scarily low?
Well, it's hydrology. I mean, as long as hydrology fed those reservoirs, that faulty equation was going to come out okay. I mean, let me put it in perspective. The upper basin, the 4 upper basin states have 50% of the obligation of the Mexican treaty to meet the Mexican treaty. That's why you built Lake Powell. That's why you demanded to have Lake Powell. Without that savings account, your water supply in 4 states is going to be pretty ugly. So if you want to hike the canyons in Lake Powell, knock yourself out. But in the meantime, water is going to have to get cut off everywhere in order to send it to Mexico. That's the treaty that the United States entered into. Yes, we have since 2002 watched the system start to diminish. And to be very frank with you, sitting at that moment in time, it was very hard, particularly for some states, to wrap their heads around how bad it could get. And if they could envision how bad it was going to get, they envisioned that to be out there in 2050, 2060, long after they were way gone and, you know, buried somewhere. The rate of change is what's problematic. It's not that nobody expected the change, it's the rate of change. And so where the 2007 guidelines, the shortage guidelines, and the 2012 Mexican treaty made people feel, particularly in some states, some of us were always far more skeptical than others, made people feel much more secure about having a pathway to buffet against that. It is moving much faster than they envisioned. And so I would say that, you know, I mean, Commissioner Touton's got a tiger by the tail. You've got 7 states that are looking down the barrel of a gun, and they have a treaty obligation to the country of Mexico that they won't take kindly to if it's not met. There are a lot of really ugly consequences on the table. And what's difficult for me is when I participate in conferences and I listen to some of the rhetoric, everyone's very good in spewing their own positions. But the answer isn't going to be in spewing your own position. It's going to be in finding a common path forward and finding a villain, finding your favorite villain, whether it's the farmer, whether it's the city, it matters not who you pick, is not going to get us there. So I think we recognized that we would reach this day sooner or later. It's just that it came far sooner than anyone ever expected.
Because you were involved in some of those agreements, like
All
the
of them.
2007 guidelines, which
All of them.
laid out some of those.
I'm old.
Those shortages, like that was a groundbreaking thing in the 2007 guidelines. Now the call is for 2 to 4 million acre feet, which is a way larger number that was ever considered in some of those original agreements that were being talked about. So was it just that people couldn't, like you said, couldn't just imagine that things could get this bad this quickly on the Colorado River?
That's exactly
just a lack
what
of
it is.
Imagination?
No, it's not a matter of lack of imagination. I mean, you can't fault people for not being able to recognize the rate of change. I mean, the greatest climate scientists have been stunned by the rate of change, right? This isn't something that you're going to say, oh, well, they're a bunch of stupid idiots and they didn't know what they were doing. The notion was always to incrementally step into it, right? And along the way, some fundamental changes in how the river community functioned with one another happened. And if those events had not occurred, then Commissioner Touton and the secretary and everybody else would not be able to even take one step in the right direction. Each one of those were pretty hard fought.
Yeah.
I mean, and imagine the notion of the 2012 treaty minute with Mexico. The fact that the United States is allowing the country of Mexico to store water in reservoirs they did not pay for and that are not within their territory is something that is of global significance. That doesn't happen. So this river community has found ways to work with one another. And that's where I've got to agree with Commissioner Touton. I mean, there is a level of optimism, even in me, the resident cynic, that I believe having a sufficient gun to their head, these states are not in suicidal mode. And even you in the upper basin are not going to be in suicidal mode, because you laugh. Take a look at what your treaty obligation looks like to your water users in your state if you don't have Lake Powell. It is not a pretty picture.
And just to
I like how you use the, oh, sorry, Commissioner.
I was just putting in context. I think that's an important distinction that Pat made. You know, the reservoirs dropped between 1999 and 2005 within 50% capacity, right? So their ability to be able to react in a 2007 guidelines, the same things that we're implementing now, have withstood the test of time. The challenge that we're having is 1025, which is one of the lowest triggers in that it was a negligible reservoir level to hit at that time. We're looking at that now, back to Pat's mentioning of the acceleration. We're looking at 1025 as early as summer of next year, and having two straight shortage declarations, two different tiers of declaration. The hydrology has changed significantly, that the agreements, while built to step it up, aren't enough at this point.
Paul, one of the groups that Pat brought up there was farmers saying, you know, you can't just pick your villain within the basin. It seems like a lot of fingers have been pointed towards farmers lately, just because of the amount of water that agriculture uses in the Colorado River Basin. And one of the calls that we've heard is for agriculture to be part of the solution in reducing overall demand for water in the basin. How do you go about doing that when a lot of agriculture has senior water rights, they're fairly protected? And, you know, I've talked to farmers who feel like they don't have to come to the table just yet. How do you bring them in? Oh, no.
Okay, let's talk reality here. Let's talk reality. Okay,
well,
I
Pat,
can sit in the Imperial Irrigation District, and I can have a prior perfected right, the most senior water right on the river. I can frame that damn puppy. I can hang it on a wall, but if nothing comes south of Hoover Dam, I've got nothing.
Right.
Take
Paul,
your pick.
Paul, do you want to weigh in?
Well, I'll add to Pat from, you know, the position of the upper basin is if you're sitting on a smaller tributary in the headwaters of the Colorado River and have never been water short to irrigate, but you've experienced those water shortages based on forest health and natural supply of hydrology over the last several years, we're living in the same boat. Little bit different about how it comes, you know, versus a dam, but it's the same situation. And that, I think, as I look at it, you know, I think it's important to frame, you know, we have kind of the system water that is often in the news and the media and what we talk about within the big reservoirs and how we're operating. But, you know, some of this for agriculture also comes down to just our local level operations and what it means for us to survive. Because whether, you know, we're somewhere in the middle Colorado River trying to irrigate out of a river system that's depleted, or in a headwaters tributary, or terrified, you know, below Lake Mead based on things, we're trying to survive and grow food as we have done. And so within that, I'm a big believer that agriculture should primarily be at the table based on the fact that we are the first to adapt. We are the front line. We have seen this. We have adapted before. You know, there's a lot of this within, you know, take a slice out of any ag producer's budget, you know, a 10-year slice over the last 100 years of history. And we adapt over time, you know, based on how things work. And I think that our presence at the table within the conversation is critically important, not only for what solutions will come from it, because we want to produce food, we want to be responsible. If we're talking about it on individual levels, it's not all about system water. Some of it is about our own sustainability. And then on the bigger picture, we should well be thinking about system water, because if the system is collapsing and running out of water, that's not good for any of us. You know, we talk about that big scale, and, you know, based on which audience we're talking to, some of it is complicated, but it's not healthy business for anybody in the Colorado River if lower basin suffers more than upper basin, and if upper basin suffers more than lower basin. Even take the state of Colorado with the way that our watershed goes, and our water supply from the Colorado River is, you know, so much of ag productivity that is west slope and livestock. We need Greeley to exist, and we need the surrounding communities around Greeley, the way that the infrastructure is there to support our livestock sales and our livestock. So, you know, the conversation teeters, you know, in all those directions, and that's where we need each other and we need to work on this. And I think that ag, it's hard. We're all busy in life, and that is a given statement. It's really hard to get ag to the table, I think, a lot of times, because we're so spread out. It's not convenient to drive to meetings. It's not that kind of conversation. And it can be hard when we look at, you know, what those private property rights are. But I think that, you know, if queued up and have the opportunity within this conversation, we have some really exciting stuff going on in the upper basin about ag innovation, things that we are working on. We have a lot of great leaders that are thinking about this moving forward with it. And the bottom line for all of us is somewhere between those terms of adaptation and drought resiliency. We all have to get there, and my bottom line driver, I care about you all and I care about the basin. I care about my kids a lot. And I want my kids to be able to do what I've had the privilege of doing. And for them to be able to do it, we have to be in that conversation of adaptation and innovation.
Matt, I wanted to bring you in here because I have the problem of always falling into describing this river as a system or as, some sort of vast plumbing infrastructure for the West. And a lot of times it gets lost that we're talking about like a river ecosystem. How do you avoid, with the shortages that are coming, that the environment itself doesn't take the largest hit?
Well, that's a great question, and one that I wake up thinking about every morning, Luke. And I want to say, though, just kind of underscoring what Pat and Paul have just said, is that, we're facing this not only regional crisis, this global crisis. And we have this great tradition in the Colorado River Basin of working together and collaboratively working together. As that stress increases, the cracks in that approach are also increasing. So, when I think about our work on the Colorado River Basin, it's how do we support productive and profitable agriculture? How do we support kind of thriving communities in the basin when it comes to water supply? And how do we do that without throwing the environment under the bus? And I think there are good examples. Pat brought up Minute 319 in 2012. 2012 was an epically bad water year. Granted, the reservoir situation was not then what it is now. But optically, right, part of that agreement included over 100,000 acre feet to restore the Delta, right? And that's a pretty remarkable thing, especially at that time. I'd say, like, most recently, I think a great example of this, certainly not at the scale kind of basin wide, but implementation of the drought response operations agreement in the upper basin, where in order to protect critical infrastructure in the upper basin, the Bureau of Reclamation and the upper basin states work together to deliver 500,000 acre feet of water from Flaming Gorge to Lake Powell. They did that in a way, instead of releasing that in the wintertime where it has limited environmental or limited recreational benefit, they did that to meet flows that are required for endangered fish. They did that to sustain the recreational economy kind of throughout the summer on the Green River. So while smaller, I think it's a really good example of how we can do things if we all work together. The enviros like me, the water managers like Pat, the ranchers like Paul, and the Commissioner of Reclamation. So, I mean, that's
great. Commissioner Touton, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Interior Department recently laid out some of its plans of how to use a portion of this $4 billion that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act for issues related to water in the West, particularly the Colorado River. Can you explain how that first round of money is going to get spent, and then maybe lay out a little bit of how some of the rest of that money might get spent as well in order to reduce demand for water in the basin?
Sure. I actually take it a step back one more and talk first with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the work we've done there, not just with the Inflation Reduction Act. Within the Colorado River Basin, we have obligated $785 million just within those basin states. So the president signed it into law on November 15th of 2021. And so in fiscal year 22, in 10 months, we were able to get that money obligated. That includes 20 projects, so $267 million in California for water recycling. Last week, we announced $60 million for the Arkansas Valley Conduit. So that will provide drinking water to that community. Water Smart grants, $2 million for turf removal in Metropolitan Water District of Southern California's area, $2 million for lining a canal in the Weber Basin in Utah. In Greeley, $2 million for advanced metering. And so on top of that, we've been making these investments with our partners to be able to use water in a more efficient way. With the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, but now the Inflation Reduction Act, your question, Congress provided us with $4.6 billion. Of that, $4 billion for drought, with a priority on the Colorado River, and to look at basins with comparable levels of drought. So last week, as you mentioned, we announced our first request for proposals. We were the first bureau to get our apportionment in the federal government from OMB, and within 6 weeks got that out. What we did is within the lower basin, created these, what we're calling system conservation. So we're looking for water molecules in the short term. Where can we have a firm fixed price that we set, but we also recognize that maybe that doesn't work for everyone. So we also had what we're calling 1B, an option to provide us a proposal as to why the firm fixed prices we set don't work. And so we're seeing those now, those closed November 21st, but we're starting to get some good reactions. We were really pleased to hear from Governor Lewis and the Gila River Indian community about their commitment of up to 250,000 acre feet over the next 3 years, utilizing this fund. But what I will say about that money is that's bridging money. That is short-term money. What we want to do with the majority of the funding is to create more durable solutions, fully recognizing that the hydrology may continue in this way. And so how do we live with less and take these systems, take both infrastructure, but also ecosystems, and invest in it in a way to prepare for climate change, for what we're seeing now. And that's where we hope to use a majority of the funding. So stay tuned for that. That'll probably be later this year or early next year.
Yeah, that seems to have emerged as sort of a tension point in the basin right now, is this either do the short-term temporary fixes or do these more like durable long-term spending to bring down demand permanently in portions of the basin. Can you explain maybe what some of those potentially permanent solutions might be? It seems like we've got a good handle on, you know, some of these more temporary fixes. What might those more permanent solutions be?
So just an instance, you know, we were talking to an irrigation district where farmers are very progressive. They're always growing different types of crops. Perhaps they don't need to water as much as they do, but they have a set allocation that they've signed up for, right? Maybe they need to only water 4 hours or versus 8 hours. But because that they've already asked for that water delivery, that 4 hours could then just go into the drain. So is there a way that we can partner with irrigation districts where they can build these small re-regulating catchment basins where you can park that water and then maybe use it in the system later? We're not talking big basins, right? We're talking maybe 10, 50 acre feet. But cumulatively, that adds up. That's something that we did on the main stem with the Brock Reservoir that Southern Nevada Water Authority was a partner in under Pat's leadership. How are we able to find flexibilities in the system so when it rains in the Imperial Valley and they don't need the water, but they've called for it in Hoover Dam, where can we park that so that we can use it again? Those are the types of things that we're looking at across the board.
Pat, I'd love to hear from you. One thing that I hear all the time is that as we go about this kind of potentially painful process of reducing demand for water in the Colorado River Basin, that you could have a set of winners and losers, of people who are going to have to feel the pain the most. Is there a way to make this process equitable for everyone to kind of feel the pain all at once in a similar sort of way? Or is it kind of inevitable that you're going to have a set of winners and losers? Oh, I think you're on mute, Pat.
If you have winners and losers, you won't have an agreement. It's just that simple. Every single one of the agreements that have been reached to date don't have winners and losers. Everyone has had a very clear understanding of what the consequences were to them and have had a clear understanding of what they need to do to address those issues. I think that if we continue the dialogue of talking about winners and losers, we're just going to make the pathway to a solution that much harder. And I completely agree with the commissioner. There are any number of projects that can be implemented in both upper and lower basin that will effectuate some efficiencies. But I think at the end of the day, this system has to be augmented. And I think that it's going to have to come from the ocean. I think you're going to have to replace some uses, current uses, with desalted ocean water. And you're going to have to afford those communities the ability to leave that water behind in the lake, in the rivers. I don't think we can, because I am probably as pessimistic as anybody about how deep the consequences of climate change are going to be. I would always want to look at the absolute worst case and then be prepared for the absolute worst case. And that is going to require augmenting this system. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Paul, did you want to add on there about winners and losers of, I think a lot of people are looking at towards agriculture as one of those places that could end up feeling the pain pretty intensely, depending on how things go hydrologically over the next couple of years. How do you see that shaking out?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. And I want to tell everybody that I only threw my hands in the air when Pat was talking and on mute, that she was the first one on Zoom to do that instead of me, because normally it's me. So thanks, Pat. I'll bring it home in the end. So, that winner and losers conversation, it's fascinating to me. I was on the phone today with a good longtime friend dating back 2 generations in my family, from Oklahoma, talking about the way that they're droughted out and what's going on with their production and how anything they have as far as hay production done for the year, everything's dusted out, something on the order of magnitude of 10 inches below natural precipitation for what they're used to seeing out there. Terrifying. And that particular person I talked about, we used to work with them as a family as far as a custom crew in harvesting wheat in eastern Colorado. And some of this where it's transitioning is that's for my family what's really interesting in the headwaters. Where the rivers flows through us, and for those online, we're a 45-minute drive from where you can jump over the Colorado River is the headwaters that I'm talking about, for the actual Colorado River. And a river that historically flowed over 6,000 cubic feet per second, prime irrigation season and peak of runoff. The last 3 years, May and June, we have not seen a river that was flowing over 180 cubic feet per second. But the plants that are growing within the riparian corridor, within our hay meadows where that's located, we haven't looked at the adaptation of these plants. And that's something that for our individual survival, as well as looking at the system, we know there are plants that consume water differently, that handle periods of stress differently. And it's that adaptation piece. And I'm very proud to say, within that upper basin, we have currently working what's being known as the Intermountain West Alternative Forages Working Group that's kind of come together over the past few months and some people working on this for 4 years plus. But it's exciting. We're trying to look at this in a way that we want to grow food, because within the ag community and picking winners and losers, that's always a very interesting and very deep emotional conversation for us, because we do this to grow food to feed the world, right? We're in business, but we grow food to feed people. Within the circumstances that we have to deal with and knowing that we have to make that difference, how can we do it better? How can we do it through the lens of adaptation? Are there plants that can do the things that we need, whether we're a cow-calf operator, livestock producer, or whether we grow, some form of fruits and vegetables, and how can we do this smarter? And when you start to add the pieces that Commissioner Touton put together from small scale water savings within the lower basin to plants that can withstand drought a little bit better in the upper basin and forego some periods of irrigation opportunity. And really that collaborative that's willing to work on this in that kind of context of let's be the ones that are the solution creators. Let's do it and let's dig deep and let's dive through that innovation. I'm inspired, and I'm with Pat. The terrifying news of what's the reality. Don't worry, Pat. My in-laws are from the Northeast. I've got my backup plan. If things come down to it, I know how many acres it takes to grow food to feed my kids. And it is that terrifying. But the ultimate reality for us in the Colorado River system is I hope that we are those leaders. And within those kind of partnerships, and we're talking about, I can't name all the different universities that are tied to this, all the front of the line ag producers that are part of this, institutions like the Land Institute. We want to find ways to do this better. And I think that we can, and we need to put all of the funding that's available right now, on the table, provided to all of us. I don't think that this is the burden solely of the individual producers for them to risk their ability to survive and to produce. There's a way to do this more collectively and think about it at that scale. And also to continue our partnership with the other stakeholders within the river system is that if people understand that our goal is to grow their food, and also that it's to our benefit that we have these healthy and thriving urban centers and municipalities, and we're willing to work on this together. And then ultimately one of the the benefits of that too is that I've been you can probably see it in my screen up here. I've been catching fish in that river since I was 3 years old, and I happen to care about that a lot too, and I want my kids to be able to see that too. And I think that we can do it, but it's going to take that that way of thinking, and that we don't want to be in the position of we win, you lose. How do we work together? How do we create the funding and initiatives to drive the innovation that allows us to do this? I think it's probably, I've said it maybe one too many times, but I'm pretty fascinated that I can book my children tickets to fly into outer space, but it's harder right now to work on a solution for growing drought resilient crops. We need to put innovation where it belongs, and we can do it. We just have to have the funding and the energy and fortitude to be willing to go there. And it is happening, for whatever that's worth.
If I could just add to that, Luke, I think what you're hearing here is we all have shared values of agriculture, ecosystem, cities, tribes. And part of that is recognizing that to save this system, to make it resilient for the next generation and generations after that, it's a shared sacrifice. It's a collective working together. I think that's right. If you say on a piece of paper, someone's going to win, someone's going to lose, they would have never gotten to where we are now, and we wouldn't get to where we need to be. So it's a collective effort, and it's a shared sacrifice for the future.
Matt, do you want to weigh in on this too? Because it's, it seems like it's so easy for the environment to end up being a loser, and really kind of taking the brunt of some of these issues. I know that you've paid attention to some of the issues going on in the Grand Canyon right now, just with Lake Powell being so low. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. It's yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, I think it's going to be harder and harder, but I think based on the partnership, the relationships, the trust that conservation organizations like American Rivers and several others have with water providers, have with ranchers, the understanding that we are stronger together, that we all collectively have to learn to live with the river that we have, I think it's going to get us through. And I think the Grand Canyon is an example of kind of where we're beginning to see, very, very specific impacts with big consequences happening right now. I mean, the Grand Canyon at Lee's Ferry was 15 degrees warmer this year than it was at the same time last year. And we've been, with the Bureau of Reclamation, with the 7 basin states, with the tribes, I think managing the Grand Canyon in a sweet spot where we've had kind of the right flows, we've had the right temperatures. It's a tremendous success story in the recovery or the downlisting of the humpback chub. what makes the Colorado River different when it comes to the Endangered Species Act, for example, is that we collaboratively kind of attack these problems together, right? And whether that's the Upper Basin Recovery Program or the Adaptive Management Work Group in the Grand Canyon. And so we've largely avoided really caustic fights between farms and fish, like in other parts of the country. And that's something we should all be really proud of. But it's like we're in this position right now where the not only a threat to endangered fish in the Grand Canyon, but the recreational values, our ability to build back beaches and manage the Grand Canyon in a way that considers recreation, that considers fish, that considers hydropower, that considers cultural values for the tribes. It's at risk, and we have to really lean into, we have to claw ourselves out of our corners, and we have to really lean into collaboration to make sure we get this done, and we can do it. And I think from my perspective, I mean, the Grand Canyon is people in the world, the Colorado River is maybe just another river, but everybody knows the Grand Canyon, right? And so it does serve as a great kind of poster child for urgency and action and collaboration, and we need to lean into that. And I've got no doubt that we can do it. But it's hard, I mean, I think as the pressure and the crisis increases, everybody feels it, whether you're a rancher, you work for the hydropower industry, or you work for a conservation organization like American Rivers. The pressure, if you touch the river right now, the pressure is real, and we have to really lean into the trust and the partnerships that we've collectively built over the last several decades to get it done. Because if we can't protect a place like the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River, for what's at stake, for its environmental values, for its agricultural values, for its economic values, for its cultural values, then what can we do?
We've gotten a couple questions about tribal inclusion and how to include tribes in the ongoing management and negotiation for some of these agreements. How is that happening? Are tribes being meaningfully included in the kind of management of the Colorado River now? And if not, how could they? Commissioner Touton, do you want to take that?
Yes, they are part of the conversation. And I think you see they're also part of the solution. As I mentioned, we saw the Gila River Indian community announce this week their commitment to up to 250,000 acre feet, a sovereign nation coming up and saying, we're here to help. And so we're having these conversations with the tribes, both collectively, but also individually. Each tribal nation is a sovereign nation, and they're different. Their needs are different. And so really being able to recognize their challenges, and they vary from the upper to the lower basin, whether they're in the main stem or not, but also their interests are very much in line with everyone else, right? These are their homelands. They want to stay there. They want to have economies, and they want to be part of the solution. And I think we're seeing a shift there, especially as this forward progress we're making on voluntary actions, but certainly on that commitment by the Gila River Indian community.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I would just add, I'd be jumping the gun to give too much detail on it, but that alternative forages working group, there are plans in place, there are processes moving forward, and those communities are very much a part of all of the dialogue of what we're working on. And in fact, some of the locations in Colorado itself, speak very specifically to some of those, not necessarily system, but local shortages of water and how we can work together to grow these collaborations. And I'm honored to be a very small part of it, and it's exciting.
All right, we got some more questions from the audience. One person asks if the panel can talk about use it or lose it. And maybe I would expand that a little bit further to talk about some of the foundational ways that there really isn't an incentive to conserve because of the kind of the laws that we have in place regarding water management. Pat, do
I
you want
think
to
we're,
jump in there?
yeah, I'm going to jump right into that one. First of all, the compact was written to exactly counteract use it or lose it. Because if that had been in place, California would have all the water. They were the ones growing the fastest. The compact, if the compact did nothing else, it ended use it or lose it between states in the Colorado River Basin. That is, the use it or lose it issue is very much a state by state issue. I know in Nevada, it's not one that exists between states. It's one that's very much intrinsic to any one particular state. Now, in Nevada, that is going to be a huge issue in the legislature because there are any number of voices in Nevada now saying that makes no sense. I mean, if you think about it, the whole way the Southern Nevada Water Authority was created, we had priorities between cities. We threw our priorities out and we said they're counterintuitive. They make no sense. What? We in Las Vegas could let the water run down the street while people in Henderson have no water whatsoever. And what do you replace use it or lose it with? A joint conservation plan. If you jointly take the brunt, you no longer need to play the use it or lose it game. And it is one that is being papered over in many instances. You can't have this fight about use it or lose it directly. My life's not long enough, not even your life's long enough to have that battle. But if you have voluntary agreements that start muting the effects of use it or lose it, that start changing the way the priority users view their particular role in their particular community, where they recognize that at the end of the day, even though they hold the highest priority water right, they're still going to end up losing if they don't get the cooperation of their neighbors. I think that reality setting in is going to lead to any number of agreements that are going to mitigate against the harsh realities of a use it or lose it scenario.
Paul?
Luke, well said, Pat. And I think the way that, we look at it in the ag community of certainly the headwaters of Colorado River is that rather than bring it to a point where we're just talking about it at policy level, if we can prove that we can implement things that make a substantial difference and do the right thing within all those different facets that Pat brought up, that's when we'll have the policy conversation. But I think our objective is to prove how we can do it first and then take it to the policy discussion instead of let the policy discussion bring it to us.
Pat, we had another question about the relationship between the US and Mexico. We had actually a couple questions about that.
Okay.
One question is, where does the water for the lower basins half of the Mexico treaty obligation come from now that we're in deficiency? Does it come from the structural deficit? Is it all on the upper basin or lower basin? How do you see that?
It's on all of us. And it is that balance between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And I think before we vilify Mexico or make this an onerous obligation on those of us in the United States, I think we need to recognize something. Mexico has been an active participant in helping to solve the problem. Mexico has followed and has cut back their ag deliveries significantly. And quite honestly, if Mexico hadn't left as much water behind as they have in Lake Mead, the system would have crashed a long time ago. So our obligation to Mexico, forget the legalese. Sorry about the dog. Forget the legalese. And whether it's a treaty or whether it's a compact or whatever, they are one of 8 partners. And it does us no good to try to structure something that would cut them off completely. They've come to the table as full partners. They've put their money where their mouth is. They've put their water resources where they need to be. And I think rather than saying, is this an upper basin obligation? There's the dog again, or a lower basin obligation. I think it is all 8 of us trying to find a common solution.
We have another question that I think is kind of illustrative of something that plays out on the ground all the time, is about these kind of battles that take place between homeowners associations, local water districts. I think sometimes the Colorado River discussion happens at this like very macro level, but a lot of times these kinds of water battles are taking place on a really local level. Maybe what kind of advice would you give somebody who wanted to maybe feel like they were taking ownership of this problem in their own community and getting policy changed at the HOA level or their local water district? What would you guys say about that?
Put your suit of armor on. That's the toughest battles. Listen, I'm a veteran of those wars, and they're going on right now in Southern Nevada. You're telling the business community right now that you're going to ban evaporative coolers. What does that mean? That's going to raise people's power bills by 60%. You're telling people that their pools can't be any larger than X. Well, I can tell you any number of well-heeled people in Southern Nevada with whom that's not sitting very well. You are reducing the water budget on golf courses. And here comes the real battle. Those hermit local independents that, you know, want to be totally self-sufficient, have to get off their septic systems, and they have to hook up to the sewer systems. It's going to be a battle. I mean, I have the battle scars on my back, any number of them. But what I think the single most critical thing in talking to your community is to make them feel they're a part of a solution and to give them a real reason why they have to do something.
And I just would add with the Southern Nevada Water Authority example, right? All of those savings collectively, what they return to Lake Mead, how much the community has grown in just those conservation efforts is a benefit to them all. So as hard as it is and I'm not at that granular level, but you can see all of those collective impacts together on the system and on Las Vegas.
And
Matt,
I
do you want to chime
would
in?
say, yeah, I'd say inevitably this question in a kind of a different phrased version comes up every time I speak publicly. Kind of how do we get involved? How do we make a difference? And I think that, from my perspective, it's, there are a lot of ways to get engaged, and Paul can add on to this, but every basin in Colorado has a basin roundtable, which is a local regional funding and policy center that the public is invited to join. From a conservation perspective, most rivers or reaches of rivers have watershed groups. So get engaged. If you're watching this from Vail, go join the Eagle River Watershed Council. Talk to James. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different ways to do it. Hold your elected leaders accountable. If you're on the Front Range and you may live in a county that doesn't have sufficient water supplies for their visions of subdivisions as they look east from their offices, get involved and help educate them. There are a number of different ways to get involved, and oftentimes those opportunities are just right down the street.
We had a question about paying farmers to use less water. And the question was, I understand agriculture uses 75% or more of the river. Some are proposing that farmers and ranchers be paid to conserve. Will that be enough? Could enough be conserved, and at what cost to really make a difference without impacting our food supply?
Well, I think now that we have virtually only one arrow in our quiver, which is conservation, and sure, they use 75%, but agriculture uses 75% of all the water resources globally. So this is not a Colorado River phenomenon. We like to eat. At the end of the day, there's nothing worse for a politician than a hungry constituency, right? So let's not forget what the farmer contributes. But can we pay them to rotationally fallow and leave water behind because they have the greatest opportunity to contribute? Yes. And I view that no differently than us paying our customers to take their grass out. It's the same thing. We're economically incentivizing somebody to be able to not lose all their income, right? We're saying, you're going to do this temporarily. This is a Band-Aid. We recognize this is a Band-Aid. You're going to rotationally fallow. You're going to have one less cutting, perhaps. You're going to help yourself, your state, and the entire river community in doing it. And they have the greatest opportunity to contribute.
Paul, you want to chime in?
Yeah, Luke, I wish I was on every panel with Pat. She does such a good job of just teeing it up. I completely agree with her. That being said, I think that where oftentimes we drift away from thinking about this is think about this with our healthy soils. So if we're thinking about this truly holistically, you know, we can be talking about paying money, fallow, ignore the land, go back to production, what happens with long-term families or corporations owning farms or anything else. But if we're thinking about actual productive soil, if we're thinking about natural processes and farming techniques that we can be enhancing the health of our soil, therefore long-term saving additional water, growing the proper forages, foods that everyone wants to eat, there is a way to do this in a very holistically amazing way for all of us. But it's that instead of a payment to just not do business and take the summer off, it's more of a way of thinking about is like, how are we treating those soils? Because that's one of my greatest fears is that, you know, if ag uses most of the water and the burden should come from ag, and we're talking about just drying up a bunch of ag land, the world has taught us, and there's a lot of models out there that we can all research and look up, but that's not the way to do it. If we're doing it thinking that way on a longer term scale, let's take care of our soil. And if we're taking care of our soil and we're thinking about that while we're looking at the water conservation measures, I think there potentially is a very good path forward.
Well, we're almost out of time. And what I'd love to hear from each of you before we wrap up is where you're looking to find examples of hope in the basin, because it feels pretty bleak these days as someone who is thinking about the Colorado River every day and talking to lots of people who care about it. Where are you looking to for those examples to feel a little bit of hope for the future of it? Commissioner Touton, do you want to start?
We are still talking to each other. We're having very difficult conversations, but people are staying in the conversation, and they're hard. They're hard conversations. But the reality is we have the respect for each other. We have leaders in the states, in the tribal communities and in Mexico who want to find a solution. And so, yes, you hear about some conflicts, but of course there's going to be that, because what we're trying to deal with is something that we've never had to deal with before, but people are staying at the table because they're committed to finding a solution.
Yeah.
Pat, how about you?
I'll just piggyback on that. I mean, hope is what if you want to find hope, look at what we've already achieved. Mead would be gone if we hadn't implemented the conservation savings that had already happened, right? There wouldn't be a Lake Mead. We can do it. We've been able to do it. And yes, it has gotten somewhat more difficult. And yes, people are going to have to dig deeper, but that doesn't mean they won't do it. I don't think anyone has a suicidal inclination. And I don't think anybody has so little regard for their own community that they would not recognize that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and that the only way to help their own community is by helping the entire system. You can't bifurcate this, trifurcate this, cut it into 8 pieces and think you're going to find an answer. It has to be a system-wide solution.
Paul?
My hometown, my home community is a hard one to ignore here. Grand County, Colorado, the most heavily trans-basin diverted county in the state of Colorado, from West Slope to East Slope. Our partnerships and the things that we do there, the things that are happening between the Colorado River Connectivity Channel and all of the different projects, you know, we work hand in hand. So I'll give Ed Moyers, our county manager, I'll give his phone number in the chat so you can call him. But we work directly as partners with Denver Water, Northern Water, all the conservation organizations, including American Rivers Trout Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy. We work with the Colorado River District, our local community, the federal government. We work in partnership to build projects and to get things done. And that's the thing that is, as we look within the state of Colorado, we've just in the process of almost updating our water plan. We just finished public review of it. We have a plan, we have a direction to go within our state. We've built these partnerships and we've proven that they work. You know, we've proven that we have these collaborations and people that do the right things and how you build that kind of partnership level. And it's amazing what can happen. And I think that if you look at that local model, it's amazing that I look at everybody that we do business with in Grand County, no matter what stakeholder, what direction water's flowing, is that we're partners together and we find solutions. So look to Grand County, call Ed Moyer.
Matt?
Yeah, I fully support everything that has been said. I mean, just look at this panel, right, where we have very different stakeholders, and there's clearly a lot of shared values. And whether it's the environment, it's agriculture, it's water for our cities, it's this amazing landscape that we live in, we're going to do it. And it's like, you know, from my perspective, you know, we are at this moment in time where this is the transition of the West, and that's terrifying, but also really exciting at the same time. And, you know, the investment that we've made in relationships and trust around those shared values is going to get us through.
Great. Well, thank you to all of the panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and talk with us. It's not always easy to have questions lobbed at you for more than an hour, but I appreciate you taking the time, and I appreciate your candidness. So I'm going to pass things back to Chris with the Vail Symposium, who's going to wrap things up. Chris.
Thanks, Luke. And I agree. Thanks to the panel for taking time out of your schedules. It was a great discussion. Obviously, we've just scratched the surface. We didn't get nearly to all of the questions, but hopefully, you know, it provides some good discussion and leads people to action in some way. I want to thank our audience for participating. And again, you can send people to our website. In a day or two, we'll have this recording up for people who didn't get a chance to view it. And I hope you'll join us on November 9th for the last program for our summer fall series on the state of the valley here. And we'll hope to see you again this winter when we've got a lot of great programs. So wish everybody good night and keep conserving.